Gloucester, summer 927. The ride took nearly a week, the way that Osrith's nephew took her down to the western hills. They avoided Bibbenberg and followed the Roman wall to the outskirts of Caerliguelid, before taking a track to the east which led down to a settlement of Britons at Penrith. The land to the river Lowther was Bishop Oswald told her, nodding to the ford. Over there is a Mont bridge, where Britons of old plotted circles in stone. The limit of her land, if the documents she owned were to be believed, Osrith thought, and she asked whether he knew where Mylth, the second wife of King Oswy, King, and Saint, Oswald's brother, had come from. For these were her lands, given through the female line through to Osrith's mother, Wyddulf, and then to Osrith. Not for sure. Her nephew laughed. But I do have time when I work through monastery libraries to find out more about our family. I like it that you take an interest. By their family, Osrith knew he meant their Anglish, their Saxon family, through hers and Utad's father, all the way back to the flame bearer. And Osrith did take an interest, not least because her uncle Elfric detested anything literary, but because knowing about their family, their land around them, was important to the people who lived there now. Ask anyone in Berwick who their king was, and they would not say Aethelstan, even though he had invaded Northumbria when he had told Utad he would not. Constantine, they would tell her. It was what Caltigar had told her, as had been. They stopped at a small settlement just south of Mont, and when she asked the question, the man of the tenant farm told her, Guthfrith the Norseman. Then bent her head to Osrith and added, that is what we are supposed to say. Perhaps Aethelstan of Mercia. Pa. He spat on the ground. Mercia. We are not Mercia. Oh, Ain, then, of Strathclyde. The man eyed Osrith with suspicion, but shook his head. It is the lord at Caerliguelid to whom we pay our tithes. Who was his lord? The man couldn't say. He had been certain who was not his lord. And Osrith saw the vacuum. The space where kingship was missing. A place where her deeds told her she owned the land. Are the lands Cymric? Osrith pressed on. In Cymric? Are they of the Hen Ogledd? And the man gave her such a sad look that Osrith wished she had not. We had our king once, but he is gone. The land was taken by the Saxons. At this, he spat again. King Owain of Strathclyde is of the Hen Ogledd, the Old North, she told him, and fought the urge to add, as am I. And she gave him a silver piece for his time and got back on her horse, glancing back to the farm, and at the land, flatter to the east, rising to mountains in the west. As they descended down the country, Osrith asked the same question, who is your king? And the answer got more and more definite that it was Aethelstan, Aethelstan, once just king of Mercia, now king of Wessex and Cent and East Anglia, who had taken the throne at Ofoic and claimed Northumbria. This land is now called Englaland, one man told her as they approached Runcorn. Now that will take some getting used to. He glanced at his wife. We are of Northumbria, are we not, wife? And his wife agreed, as she brought Osrith and Bishop Oswald some food. And Osrith continued with her questioning as they travelled down the western Roman road, past places she knew, Cester, Worm, Bridge North, Saltwick, Worcester, a road that would take them, eventually, to Gloucester. What country is this? Which is your king? Some answers came that their king was Edward or Ethelred, although that was an old man with clearly an old memory, but invariably the answers she got were Aethelstan. Dyria and Mercia figured as much as Englaland, so clearly Aethelstan's policy of being seen by his people was working. Gloucester was as Osrith remembered. Large, laid out in a grid plan, it had a bare arrangement with gates around the city in times of war or siege. Osrith recalled going there with the Albemarles, when she was pregnant with young Finan, and wondered whether Peleg and his wife still had the alehouse, and if Cymric rebels still met there. Crowds were gathering, and Osrith looked at the direction in which they were travelling. The cathedral. And Bishop Oswald was heading the two. No swords, her nephew told her, and they walked to the outbuildings at the back of the cathedral, Oswald waving a hand to the guards as he passed. A perk, he told her, and led Osrith into the vestry, where the ecclesiastical vestments and rite artifacts had a home, the cross, the chalice, an incense box. In locked cupboards Osrith reasoned that the cathedral's relics were housed, various saints would be reckoned there. But, of course, there was only one that was most important to Mercia, and more so, to Osrith and her nephew. Our ancestor, King Saint Oswald, is buried in the transept. Bishop Oswald told her. Lord Aethelstan had him interred there in a service before Tenhulg. He glanced at the side galleries. There is where he is buried, Aethliad, that is, and beyond, Ethelfled, beside him. I remember when he died, Osrith told her nephew. Murdered. Aethliad, that is, she added, with a smile. But the smile was not for her clarification, but for the black pleasure to know that Ethelfled was to be spending the rest of her physical days beside the man she had hated. And Osrith would never have known why. Aethliad was bold and bossy and stern, brave and stupid. But Ethelfled was spoiled, and believed her marriage should be a fairy tale in which her actions played no part. Happiness would roll up to meet her. When it did not, it was everyone else's fault, beginning with Aethliad. We are in time, God's fortune, Bishop Oswald told Osrith. Come, we will watch from the first floor. Bishops may invite guests to these restricted viewing positions. Others will be with us, he nodded, as bishops from other parts of the country were ascending a flight of stairs. To hear a king speak to his people was a privileged event, and it meant they got any information, any decrees or proclamations immediately, knowledge, of course, being power. So they grew more powerful, as would Osrith. Into the center of the cathedral, hurrying up the nave, was a man dressed in the new red livery of Aethelstan, the golden dragon emblazoned one his chest. Chairs were being assembled, and the cathedra, the bishop's throne, was being brought into position. It would become Aethelstan's throne, and even now red carpeting was being laid over the stone floor. No, Bishop Dunstan. Osrith heard one bishop say to another, sniffily. Who's Bishop Dunstan? Osrith asked her nephew. Oswald turned his head to look at his aunt. Bishop of Winchester, he told her. He hates Aethelstan because Aethelstan had him expelled from the church for practicing sorcery. Oswald lowered his voice, but it is more likely that it was because Dunstan declaimed Aethelstan as a usurper and a bastard, even when all the lords in Wessex, give or take a minor handful, had accepted Aethelstan, had bent the knee to him. In the cathedral, on Easter Sunday, Oswald added, with a wry smile. When everyone would have been there to hear it, Osrith thought. So there was not entire unity in the south, either, her thoughts reminded her, although there were more pressing matters to the west and to the north. And it was because of the west, because of Cymru, Hywel, of course, that Aethelstan was in Gloucester. It was here that was the gateway to the Welsh kingdoms. Here generations of Mercian kings had met their counterparts from Cymru, from Powys, Gwent, Deheubarth, Gwent saw to itself, or had seen to itself, at Seaster, under King Anarod. But he had sent his last surviving heir off with Osrith to become Owain of Strathclyde, and Hywel had assumed the kingship of the North Cymric kingdom, the last bastion of the Hen Ogledd, the old northern kings, who the old man at Amont had been recalling, although that had been decades, centuries before. Beside her, Bishop Oswald of Seaster leaned forward, for there were more lords entering the cathedral. Mercia, obviously, was represented, although Osrith could not make out the nobility. She was searching for Aldhelm, but all she could see were flaxen-haired Norse and Danes. Wessex was there, Ethelm the Younger, the grandson of Edward's second wife, power restricted to that of an alderman when Aethelstan seized the lands of Devonshire, Wiltshire and Dorsetshire, the westernmost lands from Winchester, between the West Saxon capital and Cornwall, who had been atomized into discrete groups across the peninsula. No more of the Brittonic kingship rule in that land for Aethelstan. Their kings had knelt before the new king of the Angles and Saxons at Minion, a place where, ironically, one of the last independent kings, Doniat, had had his lands before Egbert, Alfred's grandfather, had deposed him and incorporated Cornwall, technically, into Wessex. At Exeter, a large garrison had been placed and trusted mercenaries to command it. The Welsh kings, under Hywel, had submitted at Hereford, where Hywel had mounted an attack on the Mercian border as Aethelstan had been travelling up the western road. They had wished to claim back the land to Lixefeld, where even to that day Cymric words were spoken. Land had been gifted back to them, Hywel had told Aethelstan, and he was claiming this land. This would include Tenholg, Aethelstan told them, and the land in this area was Saxon. Just look at the names of the places. King Hywel, King Aethelstan had told him. No Cymric lord would ever have named settlements as Woden'sfield or Woden'sbirrig. Now Hywel was bringing himself and the other petty kings to Gloucester, with the tribute agreed at Hereford, and there he was, entering the cathedral. His sons, Edwin, Rodri and Owain with him. Osrith had met the sons before, when she had gone to Deheubarth. Edwin, named after the Durian king, Osrith's ancestor, was named as per tradition had held it, recognizing the long alliance between the southern Cymric and the Northumbrians, against their common enemy of Mercia. But now, Mercia was here, Aethelstan was here, or would be, eventually, and Cymru and Northumbria would bow to the king of the Angles and the Saxons. The king, reputedly, calling himself Monarchus Totalus Britanniae, the monarch of all Britain. It was outrageous, but well within his grasp if he could play the politics well, and use his alliances. And if politics and alliances failed Aethelstan, there would be war, and the war had to be won if he were to achieve this. A sick feeling began to dwell in Osrith's stomach, a kind of panic that was making her uneasy. Alba was strong, especially with the Norse. But the Norse only fought for themselves, although they might be more faithful if they were allowed to keep the lands they had claimed in the west of Owain's Strathclyde, and if Guthfrith, who her brother had prevented from reaching Constantine, was given Norfolk, Jorvik, back. But there needed to be more for Constantine. What would she do if she were queen of somewhere, say, the lands that she had titles for? What would she do? Osrith thought, as more men came into the cathedral. Ally with the Cymric too. There would be sufficient number then to face Mercia, Wessex and East Anglia. But Hywel was too suspicious of Constantine, untrusting because of Osrith's involvement in springing Owain from his grandfather's northern Cymric lands to be reunited with his father, Dyfnwell, in Strathclyde. And then he entered, this supposed bastard of Edward, swathed in red, with the crown of England upon his head, fair hair in ringlets with metal entwined within them. Aethelstan, looking like a king ought to look, looking like Charlemagne looked, so was reputed, in glory and light, and all the riches of Francia, all the riches of Christendom seemed to be with the grandson of Alfred. And he was brave in battle. All he needed was a queen and offspring. Yet, he was 30 years old now, and no woman had ever been spoken of as a prospective wife. And when Aethelstan was asked about the succession, he merely emphasized that he had 2 younger brothers. He does look glorious, Oswald said to Osrith, like a king put down on this earth from God in heaven. Osrith replied, and she watched how, before the king, bishops from the land, the bishops beside them craned down to Lugh who had been favoured, Mercian bishops, Osrith could see, Lixefeld was one, as was Worcester and Oxford, all places well loved by Aethelstan, and who well loved him. Shouldn't you be down there? Osrith asked. Her nephew turned to her and gave a small chuckle. Oh no, he replied, I am here with you. You came all this way from Berwick to see the king, and, perhaps, to offer your own tribute. Words of fealty. Osrith turned her head, taking in the long-faced features of Gisela and the bright, piercing eyes of his uncle, Guthard, who Osrith had once, technically, been married to. He had carefully, jovially, good-humouredly brought her south so she could bow to Aethelstan. So that is it? You rescue a lamb fallen by the wayside and take it back to its shepherd? But she couldn't make her words sound cross, only bemused, and her nephew smiled again. He is Monarchus Totalus Britanniae, Oswald said simply, looking down to his king. He claims he wishes to be so, Osrith replied. But there are other kings. Constantine will never bow to Aethelstan, will never acknowledge the title he claims. But she did not add, neither will I, because that was catalytic. Giving defining answers to things, Osrith had learned, brought trouble later. and the uneasiness in her stomach told her that there were bigger things here than Osrith of Berwick declaring for one king or another. Yet, there were people in the north, people who, by deed, were her people too, who could name no king that was there but could remember the old north, and the Cymric kings who had ruled there, who had brought peace and prosperity there. It had been hundreds of years before, as the Saxons and Angles were just discovering this country called Britannum. And yet, why shouldn't they remember it? Allah could remember tales passed down of a whiteness, an everlasting winter and huge animals roaming the land where other peoples had ebbed away, but they had clung on, roaming with the animals that roamed the white, barren wilderness, with the ever hope that green would come again. Osrith glanced down again and paid attention to Aethelstan again. Beside him was, presumably, the Bishop of Gloucester, whose cathedra was being used by the king. He was giving proclamations to the people who were coming to him for judgments. 2 men were just retreating, ushered out by guards as 2 more were bringing another. Osrith craned forward to hear what was being said. "This is Alfred, Ealdorman of the Dean Forest," Osrith heard. "He brings the case of the son of a farmer, who was hanged by the priest for theft." What of it, thought Osrith? Men were hanged for theft. But, as she listened, she saw Aethelstan twitch in his seat, and caught that the age of the son was 12. He was a boy, and tried by the law of the country. He was guilty of theft of a loaf of bread, and was summarily hanged. Aethelstan got to his feet. He surveyed the people before him. Osrith looked at the people before him, nobles, churls, peasants, all that to look upon him, and to hear his justice. And he paused, just long enough for Osrith to be convinced that he was touched by the harshness that he had heard. While the priest acted within the law, Aethelstan told his people, "I am here to declare that no one under 15 should be killed by the law." He turned to the priest beside him, and instructed it to be noted in the record of the day. That record would be transcribed by all of the bishops present and sent to the parishes throughout the land. Aethelstan had commanded, and those who dealt the law would now enforce his word. The ealdorman bowed to Aethelstan and departed, under the hand of the 2 guards who had brought him, but then the crowd parted and another guard took their place. He walked to the center of the nave and bowed his head to Aethelstan. Was it Aldhelm? It looked like him. If it were, Aldhelm was wearing the green and gold of Mercia. "If it please the Lord, King Aethelstan of England," Aldhelm began, "the king's high will DDA of Deheubarth and Owain of Glywysing went, here to kneel to your grace and submit to the overlordship of your grace, by God." Osrith exhaled, realizing only then that she had been holding her breath. Gloucester was, she knew, close to the border between England and Wales, and Aethelstan had, by decree, set at the River Wye, which took presumed land away from Gwent and Powys. And she watched as Hywel bent low to Aethelstan, his 3 sons, 2 of whom were kings in their own right, knelt to him, there in the great cathedral built by Lord Aethelstan. What could she believe less, Osrith wondered, that Aethelstan had asked it, or that Hywel had done it? Owain was Constantine's sub-king, had never been asked to kneel to the king of Alba. She could still not believe this of the Hywel of Deheubarth that she knew. "King Aethelstan accepts your tribute, of 1,000 hides and the same of cattle," Aldhelm continued, "and your pledge to suppress paganism and promote Christianity in Norse and Danish settlers." Hywel glanced upwards before he turned, and caught Osrith's eye. If he recognized her, the king they called Hywel the Good did not show it. Instead, he walked proudly out of the cathedral, past all of the people his sons behind him. "Rodri is king now of Gwynedd," Bishop Oswald commented. "And our Ord's kingdom?" Osrith asked. She remembered the king, who had kept his grandson safe until Osrith could spirit him away to Alba and his future kingdom Strathclyde. For his father had been Dyfnwell, king of the Strathclyde Cymric, and whose mother was Anna Ord's daughter. Yes, her nephew confirmed. As far as Hywel is concerned, as far as Aethelstan and the world is concerned. But, Osrith repeated, but Oswald was looking past her and down towards the steps where the rest of the bishops were going. spilling out onto the ground floor and circulating around the other bishops who were there. What does Hywel see? I would imagine he sees his old enemy being strengthened and himself being put in his place. Osrith continued. Because west after Deheubarth, it is the Irish Sea, and then Leinster, and then Munster and then Tanannog. Oswald laughed again, the corners of his mouth turning up again. Which enemy? Mercia, Osrith replied. Wessex. England, if that's what it is to be called. A silly name, when most of the nobles were Saxons. But Mercia was mostly English, and what better way to underline his own loyalty but to name the whole country consisting of the old Heptarchy by the name of the Mercian Angles. But there is another enemy, Bishop Oswald told her. One north of Deheubarth. He glanced towards the steps, and the behind himself, before leaning towards Osrith. Gwynedd. Osrith pulled back and stared at her nephew. Only a few minutes ago he had told her that Hywel's son had Anarod's old kingship. Do you think that the northern Cymric have forgotten their shared heritage with Strathclyde and Cumbraland? Oswald asked her. Do you think that Hywel's taking of the throne and passing it to his son was unopposed? Oswald shook his head. And I did not bring you here to bow to Aethelstan. I would never dream of compelling you. I did bring you to meet someone else. Who? Osrith demanded. A distant relative, who has Pictish, Cymric lands. He knows of the land left to you by Gwaidhelth, your mother. Your father's stepmother who had him baptized again when our father changed his name to Utad. Osrith told his nephew. A Brittonic tradition, Oswald replied. How do you know so much about this? She asked her nephew. I am at a crossroads in Seaster, and I hear things. I hear that there are kin of Anarod who wish to be independent of Hywel's overlordship, who put their hopes in Owain of Strathclyde and believed, that he would instigate rebellion leading to their reunification with the other Cymric in the Old North. You are all Coelhen's people, Bishop Oswald added. So, who better to appeal to than the Bishop of Seaster, whose lands his father and his uncles fought to protect when the burh was being built, with whose blood Mercia was bought and freed. Oswald nodded, and held out a hand to a door. It wasn't the way they had ascended, it was a door that was at the opposite end of the gallery, almost unseen in the darkness. The ground floor beneath them was lit but the stairs downwards were dark, and once or twice Osrith lost her footing on the damp stone. This way is rarely used, her nephew told her and answered her next question by adding, and because of who you are about to meet Hywel makes a show of defence, a promise of tribute to his enemy. Because Cymru is not united, rather, it is in rebellion. Gwynedd would fight to Thendon Yide to the south and Cymric. It looks north. So Hywel pledges to his stronger neighbour so his stronger neighbour will return the favour. And you think he should not? Osrith managed, her foot sliding on yet another damp step. Oswald stopped and turned to look at her. It's not what I think that matters, her nephew told her, and put out a hand to her wrist, guiding Osrith down the last few steps. At the bottom, the weak torchlight that had guided their passage flickered in a draught that was being caused by gaps in a door at the bottom, which swung open. A priest in a long cassock almost too big for him gave Bishop Oswald a nervous nod. Thank you, Father Fainhild, Oswald said, and took the torch from the man's hand. Please tell Father Rebrand that we are here. A nod and a quick turn sent the man from Oswald, and Osrith followed him into the room, a cellar of sorts, but what turned out to be a mausoleum. Not just a shrine, said Osrith's nephew, as he strode further in. Here are the relics of the blessed saint of our line. Saint Oswald? Osrith breathed, and she looked where he was gesturing, to an oak box decorated with stylized animal decoration, which looked like the gospel book that was now with Cuthbert at the cathedral in Durham. It was large, about 3 feet by 1.5, and it was lit by a torch which made the carvings look as if the animals were moving. St. Oswald, the man who had brought the Irish church from Iona to Lindisfarne, who had defeated his uncle, Edwin, king of Dyria, at Heavenfield to become the king of both Dyria and Bernicia, Northumbria, who successfully repelled the Mercians and Gwynedians, until, one summer, where he had brought Northumbria south, not far from the Severn River, and was caught out by King Penda of Mercia, and hacked to pieces. It took his niece Osrith, married to Ethelred of Mercia, instructed Oswald's remains to be interred in Lindsey, at the monastery at Bardsey. It took another Ethelred, Ethelflaed's husband, brought back the relics and to Gloucester out of Danish territory. Elfric was reputed to have the head. Osrith had seen a skull in the oft above the chapel at Bibbenberg. It could have been the saint's head, she thought. Osrith noticed another door at the other end of the crypt and that her nephew had moved towards it. A figure was standing in the doorway. "Did anyone see you?" he asked the figure. Osrith craned forward to hear as her nephew added, "Father Theodrin. Did anyone see you?" A muffled reply came and, after a moment, Bishop Oswald stepped into the doorway. Dozens of men then stepped past him, and into the crypt, filling the space, standing row after row, and looking at Osrith. Her hand drifted to her belt and onto Bue's hilt, watching as the last man entered, Oswald closing the door behind him. He watched Osrith's face look at the men, medium height and not much different in features. Most had pale golden hair, some fairer than Osrith was herself, some darker. "They came to me, because they wish independence of Hywel, and they knew of a warrior queen, daughter of Gwyddulf," Oswald said, baldly. "Who?" Osrith wondered as she looked on their faces, her eyes resting on the man at the front. Who could be the Dactor of a Britain called Gwyddulf? And the man who had been looking at her, suddenly withdrew his sword, and in a heartbeat, he was kneeling, one leg on the stone floor of the crypt, both hands holding the hilt of his sword which he had thrust out before her. "Daughter of Gwyddulf," the man declared, and the men behind him, as one, all knelt to her too. "My name is Sendlan, grandson of Anarord, the last king of Gwynedd." And memories flooded back as the man continued to speak. Osrith remembered nearly 20 years before, after the Battle of Tatenholg, going to take Canute's blade ice spite with Father Bailig to Hywel. She did not know it, but she was taking it to be used as a treatment for her brother, who had infected wounds from his part in the battle. Edith had used her skill, and cobwebs and honey, to bring him back from his delusional fevers. He had been treated at Hywel's fortress of Deheubarth, but that wasn't the reason that she had been there. No, Osrith was there because she was, again unbeknownst to her, she was to liberate Owain, Dyfnwal of Strathclyde's son, the same Owain who had travelled to Exeter and bent the knee to Aethelstan. There was a conflict in him, Osrith thought. He had been with Osrith when she had travelled with the Mormor warriors to Seaster when it came under the invasion from Norse fleeing Irian. She had noticed at the time the two young men, both raised away from their fathers, both with heavy birthrights, had got on with one another very well. Owain had also been with them at Corbridge, again allies with Mercia under Ethelflaed's treaty with Constantine. But now, with Hywel claiming North Cymru as well as South, Aethelstan had thought he had found an ally in Owain against Constantine. But Owain, with his kingdom next to Constantine's, to whom he had formerly given his oath now he was king of the Strathclyde Cymru, he had been hesitant. Was this where the North Cymru had come from? Had Owain instigated it, to declare independence for Strathclyde, drawn Osrith into an independence plot without actually being involved himself? If so, then he was giving up a third of his land. If Osrith were to take the land that was formerly the Hen Ogledd, the Old North, they had been a people as well as a land had covered the land that was Strathclyde to the Clyde River, and down to the River Luna. Owain had been taken by King Anarord to Isenlai, the island holy to the people of Gwynedd, in line with Aberfow, Anarord's capital, in a plan he had arranged with Constantine and Dyfnwal. He had wanted to return Owain to Strathclyde, not keep him here to be a constant foe to the king in southern Cymru, Hywel. Anarord had seen enough that Hywel was stronger, and he was old and did not wish to be the instrument that meant more lives were lost in a battle that he believed Hywel would easily win. So Anarord of Gwynedd had yielded to the idea of making Cymru one, and returning Owain, Urien's kin, back to Strathclyde, which was more or less King Urien's land. But there were plenty in Gwynedd who still saw themselves as Hen Ogledd, and dreamed of times gone where their land was centered around the River Idun. and Caerligwylid. Some who knew also that Osrith was descended from Osrith shuddered at the thought of her time long ago at that city, and the cruelty that was done to her by Griocare, and blinked. She realized that 50 warriors were staring at her. "We call on you to honor the land gift of your mother, Gwaithilth," Sindlan went on. "All hail the Queen of the Henogled. All hail the Queen of the Henogled," came the reply. Osrith looked to her nephew. Was this real? Descendants of the original Britons wished her to be their queen. She waited for a moment to see if anything else was going to happen, and then stepped towards Prince Sindlan, naming him so. "I am honored that you call me your queen," Osrith told them. "That you have come to me shows that, even over the distance of centuries, blood still bonds us." "I will be your queen," she told them. The Morrigan. It could only have been the Great Queen if the Psyche, because the sensible thing would be to turn around and leave, pooh-pooh the suggestion and ask Bishop Oswald to take her above, and to her horse so she could return to Berwick. But, Osrith did not. Nor could she be called, to her northern Cymric by the name of a Saxon princess. "My mother called me Edra," Osrith told their warriors, "and I bestowed that name on my adopted daughter. I am Osrith of the Idings, but I am also Henogled. I am the Old North." "And what do we call you, Queen of the Old North?" Prince Sindlan asked her. There could be only one name, Osrith knew. In the flickering torchlight she smiled. "Gwaithilth," Osrith told them. "You should call me Queen Gwaithilth."